Oh, I'm so tired. I had a red eye last night. Sorry about the abrupt ending last time. I didn't want to explain to my beloved family that I'm live streaming myself reading a book. Um, I don't think they would care, but I just didn't feel like getting into it. Okay. Well, back to the Power Broker. Don't know what page we're on. I don't know anything. I didn't put it in a bookmark, and I also didn't like even remotely find my page before I started this. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm so, something about taking a red eye makes me feel so crazy. Okay. Sorry, I'm still trying to find my place. We were we in? I think we were in chapter 4, driving. Oh, okay, I found it. Look, I did a little dog here on the page. I am so smart. Okay, so we were talking about how. Oh wait, he was being so insane in this chapter. He was like, it was like McCarthyism type. He's on his McCarthyism type beat right here. Like he's just anytime anyone is like, oh hey, like consider following the law, please. He's just like, you're a communist, fired. I hate you. And one of the people he does it to is a guy named Paul J. Kern. And I don't know if this is exactly where I left off, but this is where I'm going to start. Proud and angry and hurt. Quote, it was almost like his father disowning him, said Professor Wallace Sayre, a Civil Service Commission member at the time. Kern would not attempt to explain. And months later, just as the rift between the two men was beginning to heal, Moses widened it beyond any possibility of healing, with a public smear that made Kern a political liability that the mayor could not afford to keep in his administration. The commission, with Kern reinforced by the appointment of Dr. Frank A. Schaeffer, a Fordham University Latin professor he had persuaded to take a leave of absence to accept the post of commission secretary, the same post to which Dr. Robert Moses had once aspired. Wow, I totally forgot he's a doctor. Began in 1939 to press harder and harder for complete civil service reform, the same type of reform for which Moses had once pressed. And to enforce it, suggested encouraging city employees to report venality and civil service violations by awarding promotion credits for verifiable tips. Terming the commission's actions un-American, Moses suggested that Dr. Schaeffer send the commission to the OGPU, the secret police in Russia, whose American representative you seem to be. And when Kern defended Schaeffer, he was a good Roman Catholic, and being called a communist upset him tremendously. We doubt very much if you would recruit OGPU agents at Fordham. Moses called Kern an OGPU agent. Kern was vulnerable to such attack. Addicted to overenthusiasm in his liberalism, parentheses, he wryly describes himself as a sucker for causes. That's an awesome thing to be addicted to. I'm just addicted to, social change. Okay, so he is addicted to overenthusiasm. Years before, while still in his teens, he had joined a number of organizations that later turned out to be communist fronts. And though by 1939 he had seen through them and resigned in disgust, Moses' attack on him as a communist and Jew-baiting Detroit demagogue, Father Coughlin, who revealed that Kern's insistence on reforming the police department's promotion system was really a plot to place over the cops of New York. 90% of them good Christians, a group of Reds, an OGPU, who could not tell a nightstick from a streak of salami. The Hearst papers were soon yowling for the young man's scalp, and a committee of the Tammany-dominated city council began investigating the commission. That's crazy. This is all crazy. That Charles Coughlin guy from Detroit, I I've definitely heard of him before, but I'm looking up his Wikipedia page. Okay, so he was a Canadian-American Catholic priest based near Detroit. He was the founding priest of the National Shrine of the Little Flower. Is it named after LaGuardia? Maybe. He's dubbed the radio priest and considered a leading demagogue. He was one of the first political leaders to reach a mass audience during the 1930s when the US population was 120 million. 30 million listeners tuned into his weekly broadcasts. He was broadcasting during a time of increasing anti-Catholic sentiment. He was a vocal supporter of FDR and the New Deal. He later fell out with Roosevelt for being too friendly with bankers. And then in 1934, he established the National Union for Social Justice, which wanted monetary reforms, nationalization of major industries and railroads. He made a tax on Jewish bankers. He used his radio broadcast to broadcast anti-Semitic commentary. Oh no. He supported Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Okay, all right. So he seems like maybe not the greatest guy. Wow. He died in 1979 at the age of 88. And he was from Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. If you're a Michigan head like me, you'll know exactly where Bloomfield Hills is. It's so funny how something that like is true today. I don't know if it was then, but I'm sure it probably was. There's two cities called Bloomfield Hills and West Bloomfield, right outside of Detroit. And West Bloomfield was known for being way more Jewish than Bloomfield Hills. And so it makes sense that if he is truly so anti-Semitic, he lives in the not Jewish one, Bloomfield Hills. And yeah, because I went to Michigan and tons of people were from there. Okay, anyway, that was a fun little aside. I definitely have heard of him, but I didn't realize how popular he was. Like, that's crazy that a quarter of America was tuning into his little political rants. Okay, if you're just tuning in, we're talking about how Robert Moses was a big, like, McCarthyism guy and not great. And he's just trying to find any reason to call people communists, including this one guy named Kern. Kern believes that Moses inspired and helped direct from behind the scenes not only the investigation, one of the viler chapters in New York political history, parentheses, the committee took advantage of the association in the public mind of godless communism with free love to drag into the hearing insinuations about Kern's love life. That's so crazy that this guy is literally just being like, hey, Moses, can you follow the rule? And Moses is like, you're a communist, you're a slut. That's so mean in the papers. But also the public smear campaign against him, of which the investigation was the centerpiece, and that the park commissioner's bloodhounds kept the investigators supplied with fresh ammunition. This belief was concurred in by Windells and at least one other key LaGuardia official, who points out that new revelations about Kern's background were generally aimed first by Murray Davis, the World Telegram's senior political writer, who had been used before and would be used again by Moses as a conduit to get before the public facts Moses wanted the public to know, without letting it know that the facts came from him. And if there is no evidence to document Moses' continued participation in the public smear campaign against Kern, the key investigators are all dead. And Davis, who later became Moses' personal public relations man, isn't talking. There's plenty of evidence to document his continued participation in a private campaign, a campaign to make LaGuardia suspect his young friend. Moses reminded the mayor continually of Kern's communist leanings. Once, for example, he wrote him a personal letter that concluded, "Don't let Kern try to set up an OGPU in New York." The tactic worked with a mayor who was constantly terrified that his liberal administration would be tarred as communist, a charge he felt would alienate irreparably the city's huge block of Catholic voters. In 1941, despite his respect for Stanley Isaacs, the mayor dumped the reformer from his ticket because of outcry, which Moses kept alive over Isaacs' hiring of the young communist Gerson. By the end of the investigation, he was hardly speaking to Kern, and not long thereafter, in the midst of another dispute, he fired him. Kern says he understood why Moses wanted him fired. His hatred of me was based on the fact that he thought I was a communist. I'm sure he didn't. Oh, his hatred of me was not based on the fact that he thought I was a communist. I'm sure he didn't, but that I represented interference with the way he wanted to run the park department, he says. And from that standpoint, Moses' tactics were wholly successful. Until the end of his park commissionership in 1960, no civil service commissioner ever interfered with the department again. Moses's fellow commissioners, anxious for fairer share of WPA funds or a more equitable relationship between their departments and his, might have slowed him down, but he didn't let them. Moses's normal technique with other commissioners was to bully them. Often this approach worked, for they were well aware that if they attempted to challenge him, he would be backed by the press and by their mutual boss, the mayor. One commissioner with whom this approach did not work, of course, was Wendell's. Paul knew how to handle him all right, says William C. Chandler, Wendell's chief assistant, and in 1938, his successor as corporation counsel. We'd been in office about 6 weeks, and Paul went up to Albany and left me in charge of the office, and when he was up there, Moses called me on the phone. He said he was being held up because we were working too slow on condemnation proceedings in which he was interested. He was really yelling at me. He got ruder and ruder about not getting his title cleared. You don't get this done. You didn't get that done. You haven't got the this is a hard word. You haven't got the certiorari. I don't know what that means. I'm looking it up. I'm curious. Certiorari. It's definitely some Latin shit. Okay, it's a law word. A writ or order by which a higher court reviews a decision of a lower court. All right, we didn't really need to know what that meant. Anyway, what the hell's the matter with you? So Moses is yelling. I told him we had only been in office 6 weeks. He said, God damn it, I got my office organized in 48 hours. If you fellows don't get going, I'm going to call up the press and tell them what a bunch of incompetents you are. I called up Paul Wendell's in Albany. This is his assistant speaking, I think. Yeah, his assistant, William C. Chandler. I called up Wendell's in Albany and he said, I'll tell you what to do. There are a lot of cases in which we're being held up by something we need from the park department. You get a list of those cases and you have it right on your desk. When Moses calls you the next time, don't take any abuse from him. Just say exactly this. Listen here, Moses. God damn it. What the hell's the matter with your office? We've got this and you're holding this up. Well, he did call again and he started being rude. And I said even more than Wendell's told me to say. I said, and if you ever come up here, I'll kick your ass out of the office. Well, as soon as I did that, his whole tone of voice changed. He said, well, perhaps his whole tone of voice changed. He said, well, perhaps you and I'd better talk this over. How about coming over for lunch? I went over and the door was opened by the most charming, gracious, smiling man. He gave me a very sumptuous lunch. I think we had a bottle of wine. I don't remember. And he said, oh, we're going to get on fine. A short time later, he called up again and something he was mad about and started to yell again. But by this time, I knew how to handle him. I yelled back and immediately it was, oh, all right. And he calmed down. Very bizarre. The lesson was not lost on Chandler. If you stood right up to him, he backed right down, he said. He was just a natural bully. So whenever he tried something, I'd pretend to lose my temper. And after a while, he didn't try anymore. But the other commissioners didn't know Moses as well as Wendell's, and they didn't have the benefit of his advice. And when Moses' harsh voice rasped over the telephone into their offices, threatening to take them to the press, and the mayor, they thought the only way to avoid such a fate was to do what he wanted. Many of the other commissioners despised and resented Moses. When they attempted to establish an esprit by meeting for weekly commissioners' luncheons, Moses refused to attend, a gesture that they interpreted correctly as an attempt by Moses to show them that he considered himself above them. They considered the plant from a park department greenhouse that Moses sent in his place each week a gratuitous insult. I think that would be a great gift. Anyway, but while they might despise and resent Moses, they also feared him, and they generally did what he wanted. Even the more independent among them, moreover, were outwitted by his brilliance in the bureaucratic arts. The bureaucratic arts. Pointing out to a recalcitrant commissioner that because of the park department's unprecedented activity, its demands on the commissioner's own department were undoubtedly disrupting its normal procedures, Moses would suggest that the commissioner designate one of his aides to do nothing but handle park department liaison, perhaps even allowing him to work in the arsenal. What's the arsenal? Then Moses, by bullying or by charm, would take the aide into camp, making him an ally of the park department, and thereby practically freeing him of the necessity of winning over the other department's approval of his actions. Soon Moses had his own man in the office of many other commissioners, men loyal to him rather than to their own commissioners, and useful to Moses not only as liaison with other departments, but as spies within their ranks. The city's elected officials, motivated by 100 political considerations, might have slowed his building, but he didn't let them. The broad powers possessed by the Board of Estimate, the upper house of the city's bicameral legislature, would normally have made ignoring it impossible. But many of those powers rested on the power of the purse. And the purse that was financing most of Moses' projects was not the board's, but the federal government's. And the power that remained to the board he offset with his techniques: stake driving, whipsawing, wedge drawing, deception, that he had learned and mastered during a decade of building public works on Long Island. Because the charter gave the board authority over all street closings, and Moses wanted to build Christie Forsyth Park across 4 Lower East Side streets, he submitted his plans for the street closings to the board for approval. Manhattan Borough President Levy noted that cross-town traffic would be crammed into the 2 streets Moses was willing to leave open through the park, Grand and Delancey. Although Moses said those 2 streets were adequate to handle the traffic, board members said it would overcrowd them and refused to approve the street closings without further discussion and a full-scale on-site inspection. But when they arrived at the site a few days later, they found the streets already closed, with concrete hastily laid during those few days by Moses' workers, in which the footings of fences, benches, swings, and seesaws, and even handball courts were rapidly hardening into immovable reality. When the board approved of a project was absolutely essential, because he needed city funds to acquire the site. Say he would whipsaw it by stating that the WPA had agreed to finance the project and urging them to grab the money while it was available. At the same time, he would be assuring the WPA that city approval was assured and the land was therefore available, an argument that persuaded the WPA, anxious for fast results, to get its approval. If they did, he would say, the city would get the improvement and desperately needed jobs without any city expenditure. If the board said it wanted time to study the project, Moses would tell them that the delay would cost the city the WPA funds. And this argument, backed only by the threat, which was frequently implemented to tell the press about the threatened loss, was one which almost invariably brought the board to its knees. He drove wedges too. In his 1935 budget request, he asked the board to allocate $3,600,000 for construction projects in Jacob Riis, Fort Tryon, Pelham Bay, and 2 marine parks. The board did, and the thin edge of the wedge was in. Year after year thereafter, he returned to the board for new allocations, which he said were necessary to make the improvements built with the previous allocations usable. Unless the money was given, he would say, the previous allocations would be wasted. This is just his classic move. This is like saying, this is like a whole paragraph, about like Michael Jackson doing the moonwalk. It's like, oh yeah, this is his whole thing. Like he's to get something started, and then he goes back to the board and he's like, oh no, I actually need more money to finish it. He's been doing this so long. It's also, this chapter is kind of interesting because, well, I guess a couple pages ago we had a lot more human stuff, like with the Kern guy. But it is really interesting how, like, when you have 2 pages in a row without really like characters or dialogue, it is boring. And it makes you remember, like, oh wait, a lot of the bureaucracy is just so eye-wateringly boring. And it's amazing that Caro makes there be characters and yelling and It's kind of amazing. Jacob Riis Park would be completed by 1938 after an additional city allocation of $3,500,000, but the others were not. Pearl, you are in my way. Year after year, the board would allocate new funds and then would learn that still more were needed. Marine Park in Brooklyn could be completed for $6 million, he assured the board. When $6 million had been spent on the park, Moses informed the board that an additional $6 million would be necessary, and when that was spent, the park would still be far from completed. He deceived the board constantly. To obtain permission to construct a stadium on Randall's Island, he had assured the board that the PWA, quote, PWA project would cost the city not a penny. Then, with permission obtained and work underway, he announced that he would need $250,000 additional for materials the PWA would not buy, but assured the board that this was the only contribution the city would have to make for the whole Triborough Bridge project, in return for which the federal government was making a contribution of $46,200,000. The board allocated the money. Within a month, he was back again asking for a special bond issue of $8 million to pay for the right-of-way for the bridge approaches. He blandly told the board that when he had spoken of the whole Triborough Bridge project, he naturally had not meant the land for the project. He hardly bothered to conceal the technique. One of his press releases on the... Okay, Pearl is like really in my way, but I love her. One of the press releases for the Central Park Zoo contained two different estimates for the cost. But because the board had left itself open to political blackmail by approving earlier fund requests without adequately checking them, it was helpless to deny him later requests and thereby allow him to charge that it had wasted the public's money by building only part of the project. Moreover, since the board's membership was continually changing, just as one borough president or comptroller learned never to trust Moses' figures, he would lose an election. And the man who took over his seat would have to begin the learning process anew. And most important, while the board may have distrusted Moses' figures, its lack of adequate engineering assistance prevented it from coming up with any of its own. Those on the board who tried to bring him to heel soon wished they hadn't. When they dueled with him, he did so from the dignity of their seats. They did so from the dignity of their seats behind the massive raised mahogany horseshoe in the board chamber, backed by fluted Corinthian columns and wine-red draperies. But their setting could not save them from his tongue. He would enter into the chamber, hearty, very hearty, with this broad grin, recalls McGoldrick, who, as comptroller, sat in one of the seats on the horseshoe. He was very impressive, tall, handsome, and he'd always come in with a team of his aides behind him, a different team for each project. And he knew his stuff inside and out. He wasn't like some of the other commissioners who had aides with them, and every time you asked them a question, they had to turn to them and whisper to get the answer. This was very impressive. His men didn't seem to have any purpose there, except that one or two always stood behind him to hand him papers when he needed them. When the matter in which he was interested was called, he would walk to the railing at which officials stood to address the board. There was no public address system or microphone then. With the same grin. He was breezy and self-confident. I remember his coming up very genially, with his head thrown back and a grin on his face. But let one of the board members venture to criticize or even to question one of his projects, and the grin would fade in an instant. He was very intolerant of any criticism of anything he wanted to do. McGoldrick recalls, he wanted to do it, and he was going to do it, and withering with his adjectives anyone who opposed him. Says one observer, when someone else was speaking, he'd begin to pace up and down. He'd turn his back, total boredom, off to one side a little. Then he'd suddenly whip around without asking permission, walk up and make some sharp remark, often out of the side of his mouth, throwing his shoulders around. There was no indication of respect. He seemed to emanate an air of arrogance, of contempt for the men sitting up there. If If he felt called upon to make an extended reply, he would do so while rocking slightly on his heels, his large head thrown back and to one side, and the words that rasped out of the handsome, sensual mouth were devastating. I have never imagined this guy's mouth as sensual until page 477. I've never had, that's crazy. Okay, anyway. Time and time again, said one magazine writer, he transfixes his opponent with graceful malice. I have to turn a page, but I have a little buddy sitting on my book. Okay. As for the Board of Aldermen and its successor under the new charter, the city council, he treated those worthies, many of whom he told Lazarus he could buy with a couple of jobs, like men who could be bought with a couple of jobs. Or he simply ignored them. In 1939, he urged the park department's 3,000 employees to vote against councilmen who had slashed the department's budget requests. And when the council, after hearing a committee report calling Moses' action one of the most brazen attempts at political intimidation in the history of the city, ordered him to appear before it to explain the action, he simply didn't bother to show up, sending a letter saying he hadn't received adequate notice. The complexities of life in a city might have slowed him down, but he didn't let them. There was a difference between building parks and parkways in the country. On sparsely populated Long Island, where most of Moses's previous projects had been concentrated, or in rural upstate counties, and building them in a city. The difference was people. It's people. When you built a park on a deserted sandbar, such as Jones Beach, you didn't have to worry about removing people from the site and relocating them somewhere else, because there weren't any people. You were building parks and parkways for people, of course, and therefore you had to take people's needs into consideration in planning them, but only in a broad, impersonal sense, for you were planning for people in the tens of thousands, humanity in the mass, and the needs of humanity in the mass could be deduced as well from a general knowledge of people as from a specific knowledge of the human beings who made up the mass. When you built public works in the countryside, you were painting on a clean and empty canvas, and you could use brushstrokes as broad as you chose. If there was a formula for building public works, for getting things done, that was capital G, capital T, capital D, on Long Island, it was not a simple one. No formula that had to include cooperation with as powerful an oligarchy as the North Shore robber barons, as greedy a political machine as the Nassau County GOP, and as short-sighted a collection of public officials as the New York State Legislature could be simple. But many factors that would have made the formula vastly more complicated did not have to be included in it. Moses could determine by himself, by his own unaided foresight and insight, his strictly private conception of the public need, what types of projects were needed, where they should be located, and how they should be designed. Things were different in the city. The crucial factor in the building of public works on Long Island was space, vast, endless tracts of uncluttered openness. In the city, the crucial factor was a lack of space, and the fact that space was not merely filled, but filled with people with their endlessly intertwined, hopelessly snarled tangles of aspirations and antagonisms, hopes and fears, dreams and dreads. People on the site would have to be removed, evicted, dispossessed, thrown out, relocated, and removal would rend the fabric of their lives. The lives of those near the site might not be rent, but they would certainly be altered. For the physical environment, which did so much to shape their daily existence, would be altered, not only in dramatic ways, such as the raising of a block of tenements for a bridge anchorage, but in ways subtle and endlessly various. The construction of almost any public work inevitably added to or subtracted from the delicate balance of humanity that was a city neighborhood ingredients. I'm confused. Sorry, I'm rereading this. The construction of almost any public work inevitably added to or subtracted from the delicate balance of humanity that was a city neighborhood, ingredients that would change that balance forever. change the neighborhood's economic or ethnic composition, make it quieter or noisier, cleaner or dirtier, cut one part of it off from the rest, fill it with new life, or drain it of its vitality, turn it into something different, possibly better, but also possibly worse than it was before. I'm going to read one more paragraph, but it's like a really long one. Therefore, unlike a public work on Long Island, a public work in the city had to be planned not only in terms of itself, but in terms of its environment, the neighborhood in which it was located. It had to be judged not only in physical terms, highway as highway, park as park, but also in social terms, in terms of its effect on the human beings who had to live around it. If, in creating public works on Long Island, one could paint on a clean and empty canvas, in creating works in New York City, one had to paint over an already existing mural, a mural whose brushstrokes were tiny and intricate and often, when one looks closely, quite wonderful, lending to the vast urban panorama subtle shadings and delicate tints and an endless variety, so that if it was crowded and confused and ugly, it was also full of life and very human. So much so, in fact, that while the painting as a whole might lack beauty, order, balance, perspective, a unifying principle, and an overall effect commensurate with its size, it nonetheless possessed many charming little touches and an overall vitality, a brio, that made it unique and should not be lost. That was one of the longest sentences that I remember in this book. If Moses attempted to employ on the canvas of New York City the same broad brushstrokes that he had used on the canvas of Long Island, he would be obliterating the city's intricacies indiscriminately instead of working around those that were worth keeping and preserving them. And while this method might result in the creation of something beautiful and good, adding to the mural new values, it would also almost certainly destroy many existing values. A public work in the city might, in terms of itself, Moses' terms, be an excellent public work, while the broader terms being a poor public work. A highway, for example, that, however magnificently designed, was damaging either to the adjacent neighborhood, shattering its essential unity, cutting its homes off from the playground or from its churches and shopping areas, filling its quiet residential areas with noise and gasoline fumes that made them no longer nice places to live, and to bring up children, or to the city as a whole. A highway, for example, through a hitherto sparsely inhabited area that initiated a sudden influx of subdivisions and apartment houses, loading it with people before the city had provided the sewers and subways and schools those people needed, and that by boosting land costs made it immensely difficult for a financially hard-pressed city to provide such services which could, if installed before a highway was built, have been installed at a price within the city's means. Okay, I feel like all this stuff is like, I feel like he's trying to convince us of stuff that we like already really agree with. Like, I'm like, yeah, dude, I totally get it. I know that sometimes when you build highways in neighborhoods, it like really screws up the neighborhood. But I don't know, maybe it was, yeah. Also, this chapter is kind of long. We have so much left. I'm on the very end of page 479, so essentially page 480. And there's 15 more pages until the next chapter, which is a whole new section, section 5, the love of power. Kind of excited. Wow, and then the next chapter starts with the line, because of the arrogance that was so basic to his nature and to his mothers and grandmothers. I love it when we get callbacks to, what's her name? Bella Moses, and the grandma had a weird name. I really feel like I should remember it. It wasn't Roberta. It might have started with an R. I don't know. Now I'm curious. Okay. Bella Moses. Rosalie Silverman. That was his grandma. Okay, I'm going to call it, but yeah, it looks like there's going to be like 2 more days or so in this chapter. In chapter driving, which so far has not really included that many cars. Maybe no cars. Okay, goodbye. Have a good day.